All right, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Vav Amid Aleph, about 15 or so lines into the Amid Bitul that asks a kasha kipru alma sheba'u olo kipru. So, as I had mentioned a minute ago in the introduction, so we had said if, let's say, you have a Korbin Olah, and that Korbin Olah was slaughtered with the kavanah of a shlum, let's say. So we said the Olah is kosher, but it's not Olah b'alim shum chova. So the question is, did it get whatever kapara it needed to get with the first one? So the Gemara says, Amarav shisha b'redu avidi mistaver delo kipru. I mean, pashtus is, it didn't get whatever kapara it needed. What does Rashi say? And kipru al mashevu kajim shenizbuchu shelo lishmah v'kervu tna v'tnan lo lishmah v'chola v'tzarich lavi alcher mimi b'alim kipru al achet shu ufushu olav v'nafka minim. I mean, if you have to be worried about Yisurin bein time, al achet. Okay. So first of all, not every Korbin is for achet, but let's say that's why I say Korbin Olah. We're going to learn about Korbin Olah today. That Korbin Olah could be mechaper for Mitzvas essays. That let's say a fellow was mivaltel Mitzvas essay of Kriya Shema. So bringing a Korbin Olah could be mechaper for that. We're going to learn, I think, on tomorrow's Daf on Daf Zion. Yeah, we're going to learn more about how that works on Daf Zion. But let's just run with that for today. That a Korbin Olah could be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay. So let's say a person did not say Kriya Shema, and therefore he's bringing a Korbin Olah for that, but then he slaughtered the Korbin Olah with the intention of a shlamim. So we said, well, the Olah is kosher, it's not Olah b'alim shum chova. The question is, did he get whatever, and he has to bring another one, but did he get whatever kapara he needed to do for bringing that Korbin and for, the kapara for the Bitul Mitzvas essay? So granted, he's going to have to bring another Olah, but Rashi points out the nafkamina is, does he have to worry about Yisurim bein time? Right? Shelo min Yisurim bein time. We saw a similar concept at the beginning of Masechta Shavuos as well, I believe. So anyways, right, okay. So the question is, sure, he has to bring another Korbin Olah, but like the fact that he brought the first Korbin Olah, he gets whatever kapar for the Bitul Mitzvahs essay, and he doesn't have to worry about getting in trouble from the Rabbeinu Shalom in the meantime, because he brought his first Korbin and was mechaper or not. So again, right? That first Korbin Olah that he brought with the intention of a shlamim, let's say, and now he has to bring another Korbin Olah, was the first Olah nonetheless mechaper for whatever Bitul Mitzvahs essay, let's say, he brought it for. Amr of Shisha B'eder of Idi, mistaber lo kipru. So this is Shisha B'eder of Idi, that, well, mistama, it was not mechaper. D'i salka daitech kipru sheni lamu ba. Because if it enters your mind that the first Olah was mechaper, then why bichlal bring the second one? If the first Olah already was mechaper, he's bringing a Korbin Olah to be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvahs essay, and we're saying that the first Olah was mechaper, so why bring a second one? Ve'elamai lo kipru lamu kari. So what are you suggesting? That the first Korbin was not mechaper? That the first Korbin was not mechaper? So if the first Korbin was not mechaper for the Olah, then why are we bringing it? Well, it was not mechaper for the Bitul Mitzvahs essay, why bring it b'chlal, right? We said that, he's bringing a Korbin Olah because it was mevatul Mitzvahs essay. He then slaughtered it l'shem shlamim, let's say. So if we say that it's not mechaper, then why, we said, okay, you could still bring it, but it's still kosher, but why bring it if it's not mechaper? Okay, so again, if it's mechaper, why bring the second Korbin? If it's not mechaper, then why bring the first one once already it's puzzle? So Amr of Ashi says of Ashi, Rav Shisha B'eder of Idi, Achi Kakasha Le. This is what Rav Shisha B'eder of Idi was asking when he said that if the first Korbin is mechaper, then why bring the second one? This is what was going on. Bishlama lo kipru. So it says Rav Shisha B'eder of Idi, I understand if we say that the first Korbin Olah, in our example, was not mechaper. Nonetheless, the reason why we would continue to bring it, even though it's not mechaper, and you're going to have to bring another Korbin to be mechaper, but nonetheless, we still continue bringing the first one because shelo lishmo mikoyach lishmo kaosi, because this Korbin Olah that were ultimately now bringing, well, that was ultimately slaughtered, let's say, shelo lishmo, initially came lishmo, right? A person said, I was mevatel mitzvah, I'm going to bring a Korbin Olah, and everything started good. He ended up, let's say, slaughtering it l'shem shlomim, and now it's a problem, but the Korban is still kosher, and because it started off sort of in a good direction, we'll just kind of continue it in a good direction. It's still kosher nonetheless, even though it's not mechaper, but let's continue to offer it. V'sheni lama huba lechaper. And why does the second Korbin Olah come? Well, to be mechaper for the Mitzvas, because the first wasn't mechaper. So if we say that the first Korbin Olah was not mechaper, so I can kind of get everything, right? He was mevatel Mitzvas, he brought a Korbin Olah. I mean, I'm just assuming that, of course, that I'm making an example that he was bringing an Olah because he was mevatel Mitzvas. So, anyways, just to clarify that, so he was mevatel Mitzvas. Let's say he didn't say Kriya Shema. He brings a Korbin Olah. Okay, Gvaldi, everything's going great. He then slaughters, or Aharon slaughters for him, whatever it might be, the Korbin Olah with the intention of a shlom. So at this point, look, the Korbin is still kosher. It's not going to be mechaper. He's going to have to bring a second one, but it was brought with the right sort of idea in mind, milichatchila. It was slaughtered shelo lishma, so it's kosher, but it's not olah b'alim shem chovah. But continue slaughtering it, continue offering it nonetheless. It was brought initially with the right idea. So even though it's no longer kosher, it's no longer going to be mechaper, but it's still kosher, keep offering it, and then bring the second korban for actually to get the kapara. But Ella Yomar Kipru, but if you say that the first korban was already mechaper for the Bitul Mitzvas essay, so Sheni Lamuba, so why Bichlal then bring a second korban? I mean, if you bring the Korbin Olah in order to be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay. If we say that the first Korban, the Olah that you bring, is mechaper, so why Bichlal bring the second one? That's what that was Shisha Beit of Edi's thinking, to make the argument that the first Korbin Olah is not mechaper, and that is why you have to bring the second Korbin Olah. Okay, now we're moving on to the next section of today's daf, sinning after designating a Korbin Olah. What does this mean? Ibailu, they ask a kasha, essay de la achar afrosha mechapra, oh lo mechapra, miaminon. Milava achatas, machatas, the koidem afrosha in the achar afrosha lo, afocha nami, the koidem afrosha in achar afrosha lo, dilma, etc., 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 etc. Friends, I think I mentioned this in the introduction, what this is referring to. So let's say we run with our example from B4, but actually I'll change it up slightly. So I was giving the example up, since the beginning of the daf, of a Korbin Olah being mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay. I gave it as an example. Somebody was mevatel the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. B'shach b'chav kumecha. We b'shash chiva, b'shash skima, from already way back in the first parak. Can you imagine the first parak of Masechta Brachos? Can you imagine, Chevra? That was within the first 2 weeks that we were learning together. Now it's been 5.5 years later. Probably getting even close to 6 years. Sheesh. That was right at the beginning. Anyways. Okay, so he's Mavata, came, Kriya Shema now is around, 9:30 in the morning or something here in Yerushalayim. So came 9:30, went 9:30, came and went, no Kriya Shema. So he's Mavata, right? Okay, he's Mavata Mitzvahs, Kriya Shema. So he's going to bring a Korbin Olah for that. Now, another mitzvah that we can have is Sukkot is coming up. Taking the lulav on the first day of Sukkot, etc. He didn't bring he didn't take a lulav. So there's also Bitul Mitzvah. So let's say it was the first day of Sukkot, and he was Mevatim Mitzvah. He didn't take the lulav on Sukkos. Okay, so he's going to bring a Korbin Olah. He's going to bring a Korbin Olah. Hopefully that makes sense as an example. Okay, so he separated a Korbin Olah. Okay, an Olah. So an Olah is male. Is male. An Olah is male. An Olah is male, I believe. What does Rashi say? I think he says it. What is Rashi? Yeah, what is it? Yeah, okay. Olah v'osham hukbu b'scharim. Okay, anyways. So he sets aside an animal, so let's say a ram, or let's say a boy sheep. He sets aside a male sheep, a he-sheep, to be his Korbin Olah. Givaldi. And then comes the next morning and he's mevatel mitzvahs kriyash shema. So first he didn't take the lulav. So he's mevatel mitzvahs essay of lulav. So he sets aside an animal that's going to be his Korbin Olah to be mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs essay. Now after having designated an animal to be his Korbin Olah, he then, before he offered the Korbin Olah, the next morning he didn't say kriyash shema. And so the question is, the Korbin Olah that he had previously designated to be his Korbin Olah for Bitul mitzvahs essay of lulav, can that same Olah, when he offers it as a Korbin, can it also be mechaper for kriyash shema, which he did after having designated this animal as his Korbin Olah? Kapish? Good. So again, he bought the asakasha from the beginning. Essay del achar afrosha. So regarding a Bitul mitzvahs essay, after having already designated an animal to be a Korbin Olah. Okay, so he had already designated an animal to be his Korbin Olah for Bitul mitzvahs essay of lulav, and then after the designation, he then was mevatel mitzvahs kriyash shema. So mechaper lo mechaper, is the Korbin Olah going to be mechaper for the Bitul kriyash shema? Remember, in the example, the first essay, the essay from prior to the Olah was Bitul mitzvahs lulav, and after the Olah is kriyash shema. Okay, that's going to be our example. So do we say midi dahava achatos? Well, maybe we'll compare the Olah, which is being mechaper for essay, to achatos, which is mechaper for chiyuv kares. Ma chatas the kodim afrosha in la dilachar afrosha los. When it comes to Korbin chatas, of course, it's mechaper for an aver that you did before you set aside the Korbin, right? Meaning you don't just set aside a Korbin chatas stam. I think if you set aside an animal as a Korbin chatas when you don't actually need to set a Korbin chatas, which is interesting, because is it going to be? I don't remember if it's going to be on this daf or the next daf. I think maybe the next daf it talks about whatever. Maybe by default people are chayav Korbin chatases, but anyways, you don't simply designate a Korbin and as an animal, say I'm going to bring you as a Korbin chatas. You don't do that. Now, so therefore, in order to designate a Korbin chatas, you would have had to have already violated an avera for which you chayav kares. Classic example, chevra, chaylev. You accidentally ate chaylev. And because so subsequent to accidentally eating chaylev, you set aside a Korbin to be your Korbin chatas. So when it comes to Korbin chatas, the designation is always for averas previously committed. So again, do we say mididava chatos? Do we say, well, let's compare it to chat, let's treat it like a chatos? Ma chatos the kodim afrosha in the lachar afrosha loy. Just when it comes to a Korbin chatos, the Korbin chatas is going to be mechaper for an avera that happened prior to its designation. It won't be mechaper for an avera that you did afterwards. So if you eat chaylev, and then you designate a Korbin chatas to be mechaper for the chaylev, and then afterwards you accidentally eat blood, you accidentally eat dam, or even accidentally eat chaylev again, it won't be mechaper for the subsequent violation. Safachos, let's say the zelbazach do. Let's say the same thing over here by the Korbin Olah to be mechaper for mitzvahs essay. Safachanami here ochit. The kodem afrosha in it will the Korbin Olah will be mechaper for Bitul mitzvahs essay from prior to designating the animal as an Olah. The achar afrosha lo, but will not be mechaper It will not be, the Korbin Olah will not be mechaper for the Bitul, right? So it will be mechaper for Bitul, for Lulav, which was prior to its designation. It will not be mechaper for the Bitul of Kriyas Shema, which was post designation. So now, Achanami, the Kodem Afrosha in the Achar Afrosha lo Odilma, or perhaps lo Damya Lechatos, or perhaps we say that the Korbin Olah is unlike the Korbin Chatas. The Chatas al kol chet v'chet ba'i le'isuye, because after all, Chatas, right? Because after all, by Korbin Chatas, you have to bring another. Right, each time you sin, you'll be chayiv an additional korban chatas. If you actually, right, if you accidentally eat chalev, you chayiv a korban chatas. If the next day you go to the same restaurant and you order the same dish, and again you find out later on that was chalev, so you have to bring a separate chatas. So maybe we say a chatas is different because a korban chatas you have to bring a separate korban chatas for each and every violation. Right? What's it called? There's like a phrase for that. Shigi was, I don't think it's Shigigas Maisa. There's like a word for that. But anyways, yeah, each separate mistake, each helen maybe, so each separate mistaken, unintentional violation, you have to bring a separate korban chatos. V'hacha, whereas it comes to Bitul essay, when it comes to Korbin Olah, Kevon, the I'ika, Kama essay, Gabe mechaper. So, but when it comes to Bitul Mitzvas essay and bringing a Korbin Olah to be mechaper for the Bitul Mitzvas essay, you can bunch, you could bundle them together, right? If you're mevatel a whole bunch of Mitzvas essays, one Korbin Olah could be mechaper for all of them at once. Feed lots of birds with one seed. So mechaper essay l'achar afroshan. So maybe the Korbin Olah will be mechaper not only for Bitul Mitzvah's essay from prior to designating it, but ochid from post designating it. Sheesh. That's our question, friends. That's our question. If you designate a animal to be a Korbin Olah for Bitul Mitzvah's essay from prior to the designation, and then you subsequently are mevatel Mitzvah's essay, can that animal be mechaper for the subsequent Bitul Mitzvah's essay? Do we say it's like a Korban Chatas where it's only mechaper on prior stuff, or do we say it's different to Korban Chatas and it can even be mechaper for subsequent stuff? Tashma, come in here. V'somach v'nirtza. What does the pasuk say? What does the Agos Abach say? V'nirtza lo l'chaper elav. Oh, okay. What does the pasuk say? V'samach yoda rosh ha'olah. I'm reading the pasuk. That person brings a Korbin Olah, and he does smicha. Smicha is when the bringer of a Korbin leans all of his weight on the head of the animal. V'nirtza lo l'chaper olav, and now he gets his kapar. Now the question is, v'samach v'nirtza v'chismicha mechaperes? Does smicha is one of the parts of offering a korban? I think it's generally by personal korbanos. So I guess by an olah, by a shlomim. I'm not sure are there maybe by a chatas as well, maybe by an osham? I don't know. I imagine that we'll learn more about them. So why are we saying v'samach v'nirtza? Chevre, v'chismicha mechaperes? Chevre, we know what's mechaper. What is it? Is smicha what gets a person is kapara? V'aloin kapara lebedam. Of course, the kapara ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper. The kapara is with the blood. Shenemar ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper. There you go. So if the kapara is zrika sadam, chevre, as we know, right? I think we've already been discussing this since the introduction to that base. Ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper. That the zrika sadam is the ikr. That's the main thing when it comes to the korban. The zrika sadam. So then why is the pasuk saying that he does smicha and gets his kapara, which sounds like it's the smicha that's getting the kapara? The answer is Shemasa'a l'smicha shiari mitzvah, that if he makes the smicha, shiari mitzvah, so v'samach, it's a mitzvah's essay. It's a mitzvah's essay to do smicha on a korban. Now, if you made smicha shiari mitzvah, leftover mitzvahs, you didn't do it, you slaughtered the korban without doing smicha first, you mevatel the mitzvah's essay, ma'la'olav ha'kosav kilu lo, kiper v'kiper. So the pasuk treats it as though he was not mechaper and also mechaper. There goes, Abach adds, my keeper, my lo keeper. Okay. What does it mean that that the korban is mechaper, the korban is not mechaper? What does this mean? My lab, the keeper, essay, the kod ma'afrosha, lo keeper, essay, tismicha, davli, essay, l'achar afrosha. So, here we go. Attempted answer number 1. The Gemara tries to say that it says v'somach v'nirtza, and what we want to say is that if you didn't do smicha, so keeper v'lo keeper. So if you didn't do so again, so you didn't bring the lulav. You didn't take a lulav on the first day of Sukkot. You mevatel mitzvahs essay. So you come to bring a Korbin Olah to be mechaper for being mevatel a mitzvahs essay. Okay, great. And now you're mevatel, as you bring the Korbin Olah, you didn't do smicha. So you're mevatel the mitzvahs essay of v'samach yada arosha olah. So you're mevatel the mitzvahs essay. And we're saying keeper v'lo keeper, that the Korbin Olah is going to be mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs lulav, but lo keeper, the Korbin Olah will not be mechaper for the smicha, which was a Bitul mitzvahs essay after the designation, of course, of the korban. He was mevatel the mitzvah of lulav. He designated a korban. He brought the korban to the Beis Hamikdash, slaughtered the korban without doing smicha. And we're saying keeper v'lo keeper. The Korbin Olah is mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs essay of lulav. The korban is not mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs essay of smicha, which occurred after the animal obviously had been designated to be a Korbin Olah. So again, my lab, the chiper essay the kodim hafrasha, that the Korbin Olah is going to be mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs lulav, which was prior to having designated the animal to be a Korbin Olah, lo keeper. And what's the Olah not mechaper for? A essay de smicha, for being mevatel the mitzvah of smicha, ta'avalei essay de l'achar hafrasha, which of course was after the animal had already been designated. Omar Rove essay the smicha ko Omar Chayni Hosam D'chol Kamad Lo Shochit Ba'amod V'Smoch Koi Emas Have essay Lachar Shchita Lo Kamim Boylan. Rava points out, we'll read that again in a second. Oh, that is the wrong color. 1 second, I have to fix a color in the presentation. Okay. Rava points out something interesting. Wow, I distracted myself. How come I distracted myself? Rava points out something interesting, which is that specifically when it comes to smicha, it's a little bit different, right? The example we gave before was a person was mevatel mitzvahs essay of lulav. He says, don't. He designates a animal to be a Korbin Olah. After designating that, he was then mevatel mitzvahs kriya shema. So the question is, when he now brings the Korbin Olah, does it also work for being mevatel mitzvahs kriya shema? We want to say, well, the Korbin is not mechaper for the Bitul mitzvahs essay of smicha, so no. Apparently, the Korbin Olah is not mechaper for subsequent averis. The thing is, Rava points out that being mevatel mitzvah of smicha is a little bit different. Why is it a little bit different? Because how do you quantify being mevatel the mitzvah of smicha? It's only too late. You've only been mevatel the mitzvah of smicha once you've slaughtered the animal without having done smicha. Until you slaughter the animal, at any point you could always say, oh, let me do smicha. So it's never too late. Until you slaughter the animal, at that point it's too late. But at that point, the animal's already slaughtered. Kilu, you're only officially mevatel the mitzvah of smicha once it's already too late to have already, the korban's already been slaughtered. So the korban has already been slaughtered by the time you technically are mevatel mitzvah of smicha. So memele, it's going to have to be on the cheshbon of the next Korbin Olah. Masha ein kain, a person is mevatel mitzvah kriyas shema when the korban hasn't yet been slaughtered. Kilu is mevatel mitzvah esei of lulav. He designates an animal to be a Korbin Olah. Then he's mevatel mitzvah kriyas shema. You haven't yet slaughtered the Olah, so maybe the Olah can count for being mevatel mitzvah kriyas shema. The thing is, when it comes to smicha, it's only official that you've been mevatel mitzvah smicha once the korban has already been slaughtered. At that point, it's too late. The korban's already slaughtered. But at that point, it's already too late to chaparan for that korban. It's going to have to be the cheshbon of the next korban. So therefore, Rava points out, smicha is going to be a tricky one for trying to make your point, for trying to make your case here, because anyways, smicha is going to have to. You can argue that the reason why the Olah is not mechaper for being mevatel mitzvah smicha is because smicha actually you were only mevatel that mitzvah's essay once the korban had already been slaughtered, once it was already anyways too late. So again, on my Ravid says, Ravid, essay the smicha ka'amar, if you're trying to prove, to bring a raya, to try to understand in terms of whether the Korbin Olah will be mechaper for the kriyas shema, for in our example, well, you're not going to be able to bring a proof from smicha. Shiny awesome, it's different when it comes to smicha. The chol kama de loy shachit. So long as you haven't yet slaughtered the animal, ba'amod v'smoch koi, you haven't yet been mevatel mitzvah smicha, we'd say, hey, do smicha now, it's not too late. Eimas have essay. When is he actually officially mevatel the mitzvah's essay of smicha? La'achar shchita. Only after shchita when it's too late to do smicha, but then also by that point that it's official that he's been mevatel mitzvah's essay of smicha, the korban has already been slaughtered and it's also too late to get on board for it. La'achar shchita lo kami ba'ilon. And our question when we were wondering about the Bitul mitzvah's essay of kriyas shema, that was prior to the animal being slaughtered, not post, right? So meaning, our question was, if a person was mevatel mitzvah's essay of lulav, and then designated a korban to be mechaper for that bitul essay, and then he was mevatel mitzvah's essay of kriyas shema, when he then subsequently slaughters the Korbin Olah, can it work for both? Smicha is a little bit different, because he's only mevatel mitzvah's essay of smicha once the animal has already been slaughtered. And that's not our question. Our question is, we want to know about prior to the animal being slaughtered, but after it had already been designated. Amar le, Rav Huna bar Yehuda, the Rava says, Rav Huna bar Yehuda to Rava, Ema, so Rav Huna bar Yehuda suggests to Rava, Kiper Gabra, lo Kiper Kamishmaya. Rav Huna bar Yehuda suggests that maybe when we're saying Kiper and lo Kiper, with regard to this Korbin Olah and with regard to smicha, maybe so we wanted to say kiper v'lo kiper means it's mechaper for the aver from prior to designation and not mechaper to smicha, which is post designation. Rava took issue with that. Suggests Rav Huna bar Yehuda, maybe what kiper v'lo kiper means is thus. Kiper means that the Korbin Olah was mechaper for the Bitul mitzvah essay that it was being brought for, as well as the smicha. It's mechaper for the keeper also for the smicha. So what's lo keeper? Lo keeper kami shmaya. Kilu, he didn't do mitzvah min muvcher. Says Rashi, lenachas ruach lekonad lo avad mitzvah min muvcher. He offered a korban olah without doing smicha. Not ideal. So technically keeper, yeah, you can even say the olah was mechaper not only on the Bitul mitzvah essay from prior to designation, but you know what? It was even mechaper. You can argue, if Huna bar Yehuda wants to explain, let's say that the Korbin Olah was even mechaper for the smicha. And what's lo keeper? It means that the Korbin Olah was offered in a non-ideal way. It was offered without doing smicha. Not ideal. But you could say keeper, it is nonetheless mechaper for the smicha. Chever, just to clarify, we've been talking on the entire daf so far about a Korbin Olah being brought to be mechaper on a Bitul mitzvah's essay A Korbin Olah could be brought for any reason. You could bring Korbin Olah, right? Korbin Chatas is you bring Korbin Chatas because you did an aver that you chayiv karis for by accident. Korbin Olah you could bring for whatever reason you want. You can say, hey, I want to bring Korbin Olah, that's fine. But we're saying that it is also going to be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay, and that's the context that we've been discussing on today's daf. Now, Milo Tnan continues Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. After all, do we not have a Mishnah in Negoyim, fun times? Mesechta Negoyim. Vanoser b'Hashem Nashel Kaf V'Gomer. Lechaper, what's the olive? Okay, don't worry about that. Lechaper olav lifnei Hashem. Nosen kiper v'lo nosen lo kiper divra b'kiva. Yochanan ben Nuri Omer shari mitzvahein ben niton ben shaloniton kiper u'maylin olav ki'ilu lo kiper. My ki'ilu lo kiper. Okay, fine. Okay, this is talking about saras. Okay, so you have a person who has saras. He's got to go out. I believe he's sent out of all three machanes, all three camps, until the saras goes away, and then, as part of his purification process, so they take oil and they put it on his thumbs and stuff, and then what's left over of the oil, they put on his head. So now, what happens if they didn't put the oil on the head? Okay? So the pasuk says in Parshas Mitzorah, again, vanoser b'Hashem, whatever is left over of the oil after the oil has been applied to the bahonis, to the thumbs, asher kav v'gomer, that's on the palm of the kohen, l'chaper olav l'fnei Hashem. This he then puts it on the person's head. Right, I'm going to read the pasuk actually. Vanoser b'Hashem asher kav v'kohen yiten al rosh hamitoyer. You put it on the head of the tsaras guy. Okay, although our pasuk is l'chaper olav l'fnei Hashem. It's two psukim, one, whatever. By the Mitzorah, he could either bring korbanos of animals or korbanos of, if he can't afford it, so he brings, what was it? I think birds, or if not birds, then maybe a mincha. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember. I looked it up yesterday. But anyways, so basically this pasuk comes up twice. Now, you have this leftover oil, you put it on the guy's head. It says that l'chaper olav l'fnei Hashem im noson kiper. So if the oil was placed on the head of the individual, so kiper. So then he gets his kapara. 1 second. I don't know. Anyways, im kiper noson im noson kiper v'im lo noson lo kiper dever b'kiv. So B'kiva says you have to put this oil on the head of the mitzvah as part of the purification. If you don't, say he doesn't get his kapara. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Shiari mitzvah. It says Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it says Ve'anoser b'Hashem. They're leftovers. Ben niton, ben shelo niton, kiper. Whether the oil was placed on the head of the mitzvah or not, whether this leftover oil was placed on the head of the mitzvah or not. Ma'ilin olav ki'ilu lo kiper. Again, shari mitzvahein benitan ben shalonitan kiper. Okay, kiper. So whether he placed this leftover oil on the head of the mitzvah or not, kiper. Ma'ilin olav ki'ilu lo kiper. But then Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says something interesting, and it's as though he didn't get kapara. My ki'ilu lo kiper. So what's the deal over here? And that is where Rav Huna bar Breder Yehuda is trying to bring his proof from. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, kiper v'lo kiper. Right? That you have this leftover oil that you got to put on his head. If you don't put it on his head, so we say kiper, but also lo kiper. What's the deal? So if it means that he has to bring his korbanos all over again. No, that's not the case. Ha'omart bein nosan, bein lo nosan keeper. Right? No, that can't be, because after all, Yochanan ben Nuri said, whether the oil is placed on the mitzorah's head or not, there will be kapar. So it can't be that he's got to bring his korban all over again. Kiper gavra, lo kiper kamishmaya. Rather, what does it mean? It means, look, the guy gets his kapara, but it wasn't done ideally. It was done less than ideally because the oil was not placed on his head. So chanami kiper v'chulei. So let us say that here as well by the smicha, right? So meaning, so we have we have Ravuna Braid of Yehuda who had suggested to Rava that maybe when it says kiper by the smicha, right? You have the guy who is bringing a Korbin Olah into smicha, so he said kiper velo kiper. Ravuna Bar Yehuda suggested kiper means that the Korbin Olah was mechaper, both for whatever Mitzvas from prior to the designation of the Korbin, but even for the smicha, which was after the designation. We could say it's mechaper for the Korbin Olah is mechaper for that as well. Lo kiper means chaval, the korban wasn't offered properly with smicha. So let's say that we see the same concept over here. The Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that if the oil was not placed on the head of the mitzorah, it's kosher because it says va'anoser b'shemen. It's shiari mitzvah. It's left over. So okay, if you didn't do it, you didn't do it. But chaval, lo kiper gavra, chaval, the mitzvah was not done as well as it could have been. To which the Gemara answers, not necessarily. Hosam nami kiper maton behonis, lo kiper matonos harosh. To which the Gemara answers, no, this is not a proof for that. This is not a proof that it's mechaper, but chaval, no. What it's saying is that kiper behonis, right? Meaning the oil had already been placed on the thumbs of the mitzorah. Then you lost the rest of the oil, so it was never placed on his head. So kiper the behonis, lo kiper the oil on the head. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say, okay, well, according to Rashi, at least Rashi and Tosfos, but according to Rashi, you would just take you'd have to bring more oil and place it on his head. Meaning, you wouldn't have to start all over again. Rabbi Akiva, who said that im nosen kiper, lo nosen lo kiper. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you wouldn't have to bring the korban all over again. You'd bring new oil, but you'd have to do the thumbs as well over again as well. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he would just say, no, kiper the bahonis, the thumb oil worked, but you'd have to bring new oil to be mechaper for the head. So therefore, the Mishnah in Negaim is not necessarily a support for Rav Huna bar Yehuda. Tashma kamnish Reb Shimon, Omer says Reb Shimon, Kivsei atzeres lomein boyin. Oh, so says Reb Shimon, why do the sheep on Shavuos come? Lomein boyin kivsei atzeres shlomim ninu. What do you mean? Why are there sheep that are offered on Shavuos? Shalmei tzibur, together with the shtei alechem, are offered sheep. Shalmei tzibur, the only example I believe of shalmei tzibur. That's why they're brought. Elo sirei atzeres lo mein bayin. Why do the goats? Why do the goats of Shavuos come? The goats of Shavuos. That's got to be a great name for something. The goats of Shavuos. Could be a good band name. The Goats of Shavuos. Oh my gosh, that would actually be a really good name for a band. The Goats of Shavuos. We should be able to do something with that. The Goats of Shavuos. That's a great name for something. The Goats of Shavuos. So Kivsei Atzeres Lomei Boyin. Seirei Atzeres Lomei Boyin. What's the dealio with the Goats of Shavuos? Atumas Mikdash v'Kodosha. Okay, as we learned at the very beginning, it's probably, I think it's the first Mishnah Masechta Shavuos, that the Seirei Regalim, that the goats offered on the Shalosh Regalim are mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodosha. I don't remember, is it Yesh B'Yediyah, Ein B'Yediyah, Lo B'Tchila V'Lo B'Sof, maybe, when you're unaware that you went into the Beis HaMikdash when you were tummy. So nizrak damo sharishin shemi lamakarv. So now the Gemara asks. So we have two goats that we're offering on Shavuos to be mechaper for tumas mikdash v'kodoshav. Friends, let me ask you a kasha. Why do you need two? Shouldn't one be enough? Slaughter one goat to be mechaper for all tumas mikdash v'kodoshavs up till that point. Why do I need? Right, and any subsequent tumas mikdash v'kodoshavs will be covered by the next regel, the next festival. Why do I need? Well, like, what's the deal with the second goat that we're slaughtering? So atuma she'ura bein zeloze. Aha. So the Gemara answers what it's mechaper for, or the Brisa answers what it's mechaper for is, well, any tuma that may have happened between the two. Wait, so what is? Yeah. Okay. So it says Rashi that the assumption for now is any tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations that may have happened between the offering of each korban. So you offered the first goat, the first sa'ir shel atzeres, the first goat of Shavuos, and that goat of Shavuos we mechaper for all tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations, probably since Pesach. And then another goat of Shavuos is offered for any, we want to assume for now what it means is for any tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations since the offering of the first goat of Shavuos. So what do we see? Well, the first goat of Shavuos was mechaper already for all of the, at least for all of the tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations, at least until it was offered. Well, then it sounds like we're saying that the second goat of Shavuos, what it's being mechaper for is any violations that occurred after the first goat of Shavuos was offered and before it, the second one was offered, which means that clearly this Korbin Olah of Shavuos is being mechaper for tumas mikdash v'kodoshav, and Rashi points out that there is a Mitzvas essay there, v'shalchu min hamachane, and we're saying that this second sa'ir of Shavuos, the second goat of Shavuos, is being mechaper for any tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations after the first goat had been slaughtered, and the assumption is also that they were both designated at the same time, at the day before on Erev Shavuos. Both goats were taken and set aside to be the goats of Shavuos. And we said that the second goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for any tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations since the slaughter of the first goat of Shavuos, even though that is happening after the designation of the goats from the previous day. So we see that a Korbin Olah apparently can be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay that occurred after the Olah had been designated, since these Korbans had been designated the day before, and yet clearly the second goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for tumas mikdash v'kodoshav that happened post designation. So Emer Meyata, let's say now says the Gemara, if you think about it, right, we're saying, it seems like people are tumas mikdash v'kodoshaving all of the time, right? Meaning, you bring one goat of Shavuos in the morning to be mechaper for all tumas mikdash v'kodoshavs since Pesach, or maybe since Rosh Chodesh. The Siri Rosh Chodesh is a separate thing. I'd have to brush up on that Mishnah at the first parak of, I think it's talking machlokas there, although this is Shita of Reb Shimon. But anyways, whatever it is, the first goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for all tumas mikdash v'kodoshav up until that point, and then we bring another goat of Shavuos later, and already there's more tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations to be mechaper for. So it seems like there's tumas mikdash v'kodoshav violations happening all of the time, right? I don't know exactly when the second one was being offered. Was it a few minutes later, a few hours later? I have no clue. I'm not sure. But within this window, which isn't that much, it's all happening on Shavuos at least, there's already more violations of Tumas Mikdash V'Kodasha. So it seems like Tumas Mikdash V'Kodashaving is happening all the time, and technically we should be bringing korbanos for that all of the time. But Shechisech Akosov, rather the Torah says, let's have Rachmanis on people's wallets and say, we'll just offer these korbanos every once in a while. Now, granted, this was Shavuos, which means that it was one of the Shalosh Regalim, which means that there was a huge influx, I'd imagine. Who knows? I mean, I wasn't alive then. Well, maybe I was, but not in this lifetime. And so I don't know how exactly it worked in terms of, I mean, I imagine it's a Shalosh Regalim. Everyone's supposed to be there, right? So I imagine it was pretty busy there. So I'd imagine it would make sense to me that there were probably more instances of Tumas Mikdash V'Kodashav around the Shalosh Regalim time, when there was a surge in visitors and pilgrims. But anyways, fine. So the essay de la'acher afrasha v'ka mechapra. So now the Gemara completes its question by pointing out that the second goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for Tumas Mikdash V'Kodashav violations, since the first goat of Shavuos was offered, and clearly the window between the first offering and the second offering was after they were both designated the day before, and we're saying that the second goat of Shavuos is nonetheless mechaper for those subsequent violations. So the Gemara says, well, ida frashinu bivasacha sochinam. So the Gemara says, look, if the two goats of Shavuos were designated together the day before at the same time, well, yeah, there really wouldn't be any reason to offer the second goat of Shavuos, because Olahs are not mechaper for subsequent Bitul Mitzvas essay. Right? The Gemara is saying, no, Olahs are not mechaper for subsequent Bitul Mitzvahs essays. And therefore, if both goats of Shavuos were designated together at the same time the day before, then there really wouldn't be any sense in offering that second goat of Shavuos, because the first goat will have already been mechaper for any violations up until their designation, and the second goat would not be mechaper for anything that happened after that, because Olahs are not mechaper for Bitul essays that happen subsequently. Hachab mayaskinon. What are we talking about over here? The afrashinu boze acharze. So says the Gemara, well, what's happening here is that the day before, when the animals were being designated, now I don't know so much about designating korbanos. It sounds like from Rashi that all of the designating was happening the day before. Is that like a thing? Do you have to designate it from the day before? You can't designate it on Yom Tov, or is this just what the Gemara is saying? I'm not sure. But anyways, we're saying that the two animals, these two goats of Shavuos, were designated the day before, but boze acharze. We're talking about, and interestingly, it sounds like this isn't necessarily a chiyuv, like you don't have to designate them separately, but the pasuk is talking about a case where the two goats of Shavuos were not designated at the same time, but one goat of Shavuos was designated, and then at a later point, the second goat of Shavuos was designated, and the second goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for any Tumas Mikdash V'Kodashav that was violated between the time that the first goat was designated and the second goat was designated on Erev Shavuos. But now, fact the Gemara v'leiku v'leima le'likra t'chiksiva boze'acher ze'ksiva. 1 second. We have a pasuk in the Torah that is talking about only situations where the two goats of Shavuos were not designated together, but rather one after the other. Kilu. It's I don't know what the word I'm thinking of is, but it's certainly not objective. It's not contextual, but no, I don't think consequential is the right word either. But okay, this isn't definitive. It's like kind of thrown up in the air kind of thing. Like the pasuk is. I mean, does the Gemara point it out or Rashi? I think Rashi points it out. Kilo, look, we bring these korbanos every single year. We bring two kisbei, or two seirei atzereses every single year. Like that's what we do. And yet the Gemara is trying to make it out as if like actually, when the pasuk talks about these two seirei atzeres, it's talking about in the event that they happen to have separated the goats at different times the day before. So then the second one will be mechaper for what happened in between. But if they were designated at the same time, so then it wouldn't. Right? V'leiku v'leima leikra the chiksiva baza achas chiksiva. What the pasuk is only talking about for in an instance where they happen to have been separated, designated at separate time. That's what the pasuk is talking about. Okay, Chaver. So now we move into the discussion of leiv besdin masneh alein. Okay, let's go weiter, and then we'll explain things in a momentarily. So Amar Papa says, Papa, you know what? The korbanos, both goats of Shavuos, were separated the day before at the same time. Sure, they're designated at the same time. And yes, we bring two goats of Shavuos every year. And then there's nothing circumstantial. Maybe that's the word. I think probably that's probably the word I was thinking of, circumstantial. I think that's probably the word I was thinking of. There's nothing circumstantial. The two goats of Shavuos are separated at the same time the day before. However, Papa says, we're talking about communal offerings, right? These are communal goat offerings on Shavuos. Shiny korbanos tzibor, communal offerings are different. Delay besdin kamasne alein, because the heart of besdin stipulates about them. What does it mean that the heart of besdin stipulates about them? So again, this is a Gemara that we learned about Masechta Shavuos. It's very interesting Gemara, just the way that it works. An interesting concept. Basically, the leiv besdin masneh alein, that basically the heart of besdin makes a stipulation about them. What does it mean? It means that, well, normally, I guess if one would separate a Korbin, that Korbin is separated, right? We've been talking about, let's say, a person was mevatel Mitzvas essay, he separates a Korbin Olah to be mechaper for the Bitul Mitzvas essay. Okay, the animal has been designated as the Korbin, and that is that. But leiv besdin masneh alein means that besdin kind of like bakes in to their designation. It's like a more complex, it's a more layered designation with actually like Tanai's stipulations built into them. So what does that mean? It means when these two goats were set aside, it was actually set aside with the understanding that the real designation for the second goat was really only going to be right before it was going to be offered. So Kilu, when besdin designates these two goats from the day before, kind of baked into their designation is that the real designation of the second goat is really only going to be right before it is going to be offered the next day. And that is why the second goat of Shavuos is going to be mechaper for any tumas mikdash v'kodashav that happened up until that point, because it was really only being designated at the point that it is being offered. So even though, yes, they're being designated from the day before, but baked into that designation is that the real designation is really only happening at the time, right before it's going to be offered. So leiv besdin masneh alein is kind of like when it comes to these communal offerings, when the offering is set aside, it's not so straightforward that it's just simply being set aside and done. Worked into the designation is more layers. In this case, that layer being that the real designation for the second goat is really only going to be right before it is going to be offered. So again, Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, look, so this is going with the understanding, the assumption still, that a Korbin Olah cannot be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvahs essay that happened after its designation, and therefore says Rav Papa, the goat of Shavuos is only going to be mechaper for Tumas Mitzvahs v'Kodashim that happened prior to its designation. However, Rav Papa points out this is a communal offering. Korbin Olah, we're talking about a communal goat offering. Korbin Olah. Shiny Korbin Olah, it's different when it comes to communal offerings, because when it comes to communal offerings, the besdin kamas naleim, the heart of besdin is making a stipulation about it. This next line is controversial. This next line is very, very controversial. This next line is very controversial. Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos based on the Gemara in Shavuos. I still haven't decided how I'm going to explain it. Let's see. Rav Yudah Mar Shmuel, it's like Rav Yudah Mar Shmuel, the Amar Rav Yudah Mar Shmuel, Korbanos tzibur sakin v'shachten l'mashein. That communal offerings, the knife that slaughters them decides what they are. How to explain that? I'll explain it like Tosfos. Rashi's they're all a little, Rashi I think is more tricky than Tosfos. That's him. Tosfos explains it based on the Aruch. Basically, you have these animals that are set aside to be Korbin Tamid. I think that there are, if I remember correctly, or if this is even correct, I think there's a lishka in the Beis Hamikdash called the Lishkas Atulaim. We might be referring to that, and I think that in the Lishkas Atulaim, I think that there were always 6 animals ready to be offered as Korbin Tamid. And we're saying that the Korbanos tzibur sakin mushachten l'mashein. If for whatever, so you have this animal that's set aside to be a Korbin Tamid, but if for whatever reason they want to or need to offer it as a Korbin Musaf, that's fine, because even though besdin had set these aside to be Korbin Tamids, at the end of the day, built into their setting asiding, to their designation, was that really whoever is going to be slaughtering them, it would be actually at that point that it would be designated. Therefore, even though these sheep are really here to be Korbin Tamids, but if for whatever reason they need to slaughter it as a Korbin Musaf, that is also fine. So built into the designation of these animals as Korbin Tamids is also the Tanai that the fact of the matter is, really whoever slaughters them, if they need to slaughter for something else, that is also fine. Okay, Seder. Without getting too into the details over here, it's a little bit of a tricky line, why it's doing it, why it's over here. Rashi says just actually delete this line. Anyways, but okay, the point is that we're saying that by Korbanos Tzibur, we could say besdin masneh, and relevant to our Gemara, apropos to our Gemara, would be that even though the goats of Shavuos are being designated the day from Erev Shavuos, the day before Shavuos, the baked into the designation is that the second goat of Shavuos is really only going to be designated right before it's going to be offered, so that it can be mechaper, and therefore it can be mechaper for any tumas mikdash v'kodoshav that happens up until the point that it is offered. But now the Gemara asks a great question. The great question of the Gemara is that we are talking about Reb Shimon. If you back up about 15 or 20 lines or so, we had said, Toshma Reb Shimon or Kivsi Atzeres Lamei Bain, etc. This discussion that we've been having now is according to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says that these goats of Atzeres, that these goats of Shavuos, they come for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav, and the second one is being mechaper for whatever happened after the first one was for any tumas mikdash for Gadashav, since the first goat of Shavuos was offered. This whole thing was a discussion of Reb Shimon, and we wanted to argue, right? We just explained that Bitul Mitzvahs essay after Korbin Olah has been designated, the Korbin Olah will not be mechaper for it. So then, how do we explain that the second goat of Shavuos is being mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodashav up until the point where it's offered? Well, we said late besdin masneh that when besdin was when we designated these two goats from the day before, really baked into that was that the real designation of the second goat was going to be right before its slaughter. Late besdin masneh. The thing is, friends, Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. That's the thing, friends. Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. That is the thing. Amalei Rav Yosef Breder Rav Shmuel l'Rav Papa says Rav Yosef Breder Rav Shmuel to Rav Papa umi ist le Reb Shimon lev besdin masneh. But one second, we're trying to explain Reb Shimon by saying lev besdin masneh, and Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. V'amar Rav Idi Paroven Amar Rav Amim Amar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav Yechanan Tmidin shelo utzuchu l'tzibur. Now this was from Masechta Shavuos. This was from Masechta Shavuos. I'll explain it now. Maybe it'll ring a bell. The divrei Reb Shimon ein nifrad ein nifdin tamimim l'divrei chachamim nifdin tamimin. There's a very interesting sugya that we learned in Masechta Shavuos. That these, right? We talked about a minute ago about these 6 animals. What is a keves echad? I guess 6 sheep. Right, the Lishkas Atloim. I think this was in the Lishkas Atloim. So you had these 6 sheep that were always there ready to be offered as Korbin Tomits. Now the thing is, friends, who purchased these 6 sheep? What were the funds that were used to purchase these 6 sheep that were always there ready to be offered as Korbin Tomits? The communal funds. What are the communal funds? The Trumas Halishka, the Machzis HaShekel. The donations that were collected every year, the Machzis HaShekel, the Shkolim, that they collected every year in order, that was used to pay for these sheep. Now the thing is, what would happen is, comes Nisan, right? It's a new year. What are we up to? Where are we now? We're not at Nisan. We're almost at Tishrei. We're almost at Rosh Hashanah. Now, I think maybe when you listen to this, maybe it'll already be Rosh Hashanah. Maybe this will be on Rosh Hashanah. But anyways, comes the first of Nisan. So we only want to be using, at this point, comes the first of Nisan, we only want to be using korbanos that have been purchased with the new Trumas Halishka, with the new Shkolim, with the new donations. We don't want to be using sheep that had been purchased with the old donations. So now what happens, because you have these 6 sheep that have been purchased with the funds from the previous year, comes the first of Nisan, you have these 6 sheep, they were purchased with the funds of the previous year. We don't want to offer korbanos purchased with the funds from the previous year. So what happens to those animals? So the Chachamim say, lev besdin masneh. What does that mean? It means that milchatchila, when besdin, or when we had set aside these sheep to be the 6 sheep that we would have as korbanos, milchatchila, when they were set aside with the understanding that comes the first of Nisan, they should be able to be redeemed even as chulu. What does Rashi say? So if they were needed prior to the first of Nisan, great. Otherwise, it shouldn't be kodshei aguf. It should only be kodshei. There's kodshei aguf and there's kodshei damim. Is that what it's called? Kodshei damim? I feel like that doesn't sound right. There's kodshei haguf and there's kodshei damim. It doesn't sound, for some reason, it doesn't sound right. But anyways, so besdin makes a t'nai and says, look, if these sheep that we're setting aside over here are needed before the first of Nisan, great. Well, then they'll be, we'll use them as korbanos, great. But if not, well, then they're only hektish for damim, for their value, and we'll be able to. So therefore, what can we do? We can be poted them, right? Something that's kodesh kedushas haguf, you can't be poted. But if it's only kedushas damim, I think that's probably what I'm looking for. Kedushas haguf and kedushas damim. If it's only kedushas damim, well, then you can be poted. Then you can be poted. So what do you do with these sheep? Comes the first of Nisan. We don't want to offer them as they are because they were purchased with the funds from the previous year. So what we'll do is say, well, they're only kadosh kedushas damim, so we can redeem them. So what we'll do is we'll take some chulin money. We'll take some chulin money, and we will transfer the kedusha of these korbanos, these animals that were set aside with using the previous year's funds. We'll transfer their kedusha onto this chulin money. The chulin money now is basically what's considered mosar alishka. It's like leftover funds from the previous year, which we'll use, I believe, for kayetz and mizbeach. But now these animals are no longer holy. Now that they're no longer holy, we can now use the funds from the new year in order to repurchase these animals. And now they've been purchased with the funds of the new year, and they can be offered in the new year, now that it's the first of Nisan. So the point being, so the Chacham say that you can do this scheme. Because lev besdin masneh, that besdin, be'etzim, worked into the designation that should the first of Nisan come, it'll only be kedushas damim, and we'll be able to be poded these animals basically and repurchase them for the new funds. According to Rav Shimon, we don't say lev besdin masneh, and we would just directly, we can't offer them as korbanos, as korban tamid for the new year because they were purchased with the old funds, but we could just directly offer them as olas. We don't have this whole redeeming thing. He doesn't hold lev besdin masneh. So what do we see? So we see that Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. So Reb Shimon had said that this goat, that the second goat of Shavuos is going to be mechaper and tumas mitash v'kodashav. That happened post the offering of the first goat of Shavuos. The thing is that both goats were designated the day before, and Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. So we wanted to say that, well, really worked into the designation is that the designation of the second goat would really just be right before it was offered. But the thing is that's lev besdin. That means that worked into the designation was this stipulation. But Reb Shimon doesn't hold of that. So it sounds like, in order to make sense of Reb Shimon, it sounds like we'd have to say that the second goat is being mechaper for tumas mikdash v'kodosha violations that happen subsequent to its designation from the day before. Let's read it inside. From Vav Mud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. V'amar of Idi, par Oven, Amar of Amram, Amar of Yitzchak, Amar of Yechanan, Tibidin Shelo Utzuchu L'tzibur, that these korban tamids that were ultimately not needed because it's now the first day of Nisan and they haven't been offered, and we don't want to offer Mosar Alishka. We don't want to offer stuff left over from the previous year's funds. So the Reb Shimon ain't nifted. Reb Shimon says you can't be poda these sheep because we don't say lev besdin masneh, that if they're not used then they'll only be kedushas damim and you can be poda. No, we don't say lev besdin masneh. Ain't nifted tamimim. Right? If they're healthy, we can't be poda them. The Chacham niftin tamimin. Chacham say even if they're healthy, we can still be poda because lev besdin masneh. But Reb Shimon doesn't hold of lev besdin masneh. V'od and more. So haba mine Reb Yirmiyah Reb Zer. Reb Yirmiyah asks a kasha to Reb Zer. What's the kasha? Seirei atzeres shekibel damim b'shnei kosis. Interesting. So Reb Yirmiyah asks Reb Zer, the goats of Shavuos that have both been slaughtered and their blood has been received in 2 vessels. So they've both already been slaughtered. They've both already been slaughtered. V'nizrak damo shel rishon, and there's zrikas adam for the first goat of Shavuos. Sheni lamu uba. Why is the second. Well, why are we then going to be doing Zrikas Adam for the second goat of Shavuos? Al Tuma She'ura ben Zrika Shel Zeh Lazeh. Well, it'll be mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happens between the Zrikas Adam of the first goat of Shavuos, between the Zrikas Adam, the first goat of Shavuos, and the second goat of Shavuos. Wow. Well, clearly at this point, right, both goats of Shavuos have already been slaughtered. So they've definitely been designated already. They've already been slaughtered even. The Zrikas Adam has already transpired for the first goat of Shavuos. And we're saying that why are we doing Zrikas Adam for the second goat of Shavuos? Well, because in between the Zrikas Adam of the first goat and the second goat, for whatever Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav would have happened in between, the second goat is going to be mechaper for that. Okay, well then clearly we're talking about Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that is happening obviously after both goats have been designated. They've already been slaughtered, not just designated. Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking Reb Zera about Reb Yirmiyah is asking Reb Zera about Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happens in between the Zrikas Adams after Shchita. Aval Esei Telachar Afrasha lo kami ba'ilei. Reb Yirmiyah does not feel the need to ask Reb Zera about Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happened after the designation. I mean, that sounded like that was not a question. Obviously, the goat of Shavuos will be mechaper for that Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav. The question is, what about Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happened not only just after the designation, but after the Shechita? Answers the Gemara, Dilman Timtzi Lomar Kamer. Not necessarily. Maybe you could say that it's saying if you want to say, meaning maybe what Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking Reb Zera is, if you want to say that the goat of Shavuos is mechaper for Averis, for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happens after the designation, if you want to say that, well then, what about this? What about Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happens after Shechita? Would the goat of Shavuos be mechaper for that? So Kilu, it's not definitive that the halacha is that the goat would be mechaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodoshav that happens after designation. If it is mechaper for post-designation, well then what about post-shchita? So it's not necessarily a proof. There is that question about, the fact that what about Reb Shimon's brisa? Look, Tosfos talks about it. There is the possibility you could have given the original answer of the pasuk is just kind of, you could say that it's only mechaper for stuff prior to designation. Maybe the pasuk is talking about where the designated one and then the other, but the Gemara seems to be inconclusive, right? We had just spent, a whole bunch of hashkoyel and invested ourselves in the sugya of Korbin Olah being mechaper for Mitzvas essay post designation. It seems that it's inconclusive. Okay, that was Daf Vav of Masechta Zevachim. It may have been another long one. I don't know what's what anymore. The first thing that we discussed on Daf Vav of Masechta Zevachim is the non-lishmah Korbin mechaper, right? We had talked about that if let's say a Korbin Olah is slaughtered shelo lishma, so he said it's kosher, but it's not Olah l'bayil m'shem chova. So the question is, the first Korbin that we said is kosher, is it mechaper or not? So the conclusion was that no, it's not mechaper, which is why you're bringing a replacement. Okay. Sinning after designating a Korbin Olah. So that was really the big sugya of today, is that if a person separates a Korbin Olah to be mechaper for Bitul Mitzvas essay, and after designating the Korbin, he then does mevato more Mitzvas essay, so can that Olah be mechaper for the subsequent Bitul Mitzvas essays? So unclear if the Korbin Olah will be mechaper for those sins. I mean, the truth is, I think Tosfos Taka assumes that it would not be mechaper for subsequent sins, but I think it wasn't particularly clear. There definitely was not a clear conclusion in the Gemara, in my view. And at the end of that sugya, we got into a very interesting sugya of besdin masneh, about besdin kind of working into designations and stipulations, their own kind of stipulations. And we said Rav Shimon doesn't hold of the concept of besdin masneh alein, and the Rabbanon do hold of that concept. Friends, I hope you enjoyed that Vav of Masechta Zevachim. Cheers.